It's a pleasure to welcome you all to this last research seminar of the academic year. And we've got Professor Matt Uttley talking about research impact in UK defence industrial policy. I can't think of someone better qualified to speak on this. He's done so much work with government and ongoing work on the UK's defence policy, and particularly defence economics and industry.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Tracy, a big thanks for that introduction. And I'd like to say it's good to see you all, but I can't see you. But knowing you're there is important. And thank you for attending this seminar. It's probably slightly different to previous research seminars we've had in the sense that I won't be talking in detail about a particular piece of research, but rather about a project that commenced in early 2015, intended quite explicitly to generate research impact in terms of UK public policy in the defence sector. I should mention at the outset that this work has been done as part of a team, and the other two core team members have been Benedict Wilkinson, who is at the Policy Institute at King's, and Andrew Dorman, who will be familiar to all of you. Next slide, please. So by way of an overview, I'm going to cover three main areas in the next 10-15 minutes or so. And the first is the question of motives for focusing on research impact. We've all heard that we should do this, but why in particular was the team I work with, keen on making this a high-profile element of our research agendas? I'm secondly going to, in effect, walk you through the pathways to impact in the UK defence industrial policy sector. And you can see this as a sort of chronological case study, if you like, of key developments in the work that we've done. And then finally, I'm going to give my own reflections on impact as an activity in public policy spaces, just key observations that I think might be of interest to you. So moving to first section, I'm going to start talking about motives. So Tracy, next slide, please. So I think it's probably fair to say that from my perspective and the group's perspective, there are two kind of motives for making research impact front and centre, if you like, of some aspects of the research we've been doing over the last 5 years or so. And the first motive force, if you like, could be seen as intrinsic motives, based on the notion that doing this kind of thing is a good thing to do. And I think the assumptions we've made in this approach is really to acknowledge that knowledge and expertise is dispersed between academia and public policy practitioners. And therefore, each of those participant groups can gain insights from the co-production of knowledge with each other that would be very, very much more difficult for them to generate on their own. And thirdly, the assumption that there's a potential that better evidence-based research leads to better evidence-based academic research outcomes, as well as public policy outcomes. At least these are motives, if you like, that have driven us and aims that we've aspired to. But there are also instrumental motives, and we live in an instrumental world where performance indicators matter and have implications. And so the instrumental motive for doing this kind of thing really has been largely, to maximise gains, if you like, from impact work. I won't go through this second part of the slide in detail. I mean, it's fairly straightforward to read, but hopefully, if I give you a moment or so, you'll get the key points I'm raising there. In other words, if you look at the potential for impact case studies, they're quite significant in the scheme of things regarding REF. Okay, next slide, please. So I'm now moving on to the second bit. So I think it's important, before explaining what we've been up to for the last 5 years or so, it's important that I explain the kind of public policy problematic, or the policy space that we've tried to enter and produce impactful outcomes in. And I know defence procurement stuff pretty well, but I recognise that most people run a country mile from it. If you don't mind, I'm just going to give you a bit of orientation that talks about the kind of imperatives that governments confront in their weapons acquisitions process and the industrial policies that go along with them, and where the work we have done fits into that. Okay, so if we look at defence procurement and industrial policy development, we see a number of imperatives at work that confront decision makers in defence. The first is that they need to ensure that the armed services are provided with state-of-the-art weapons systems. So the emphasis in much of this is on the performance of the capability, with cost sometimes a secondary driver. And this reflects a tournament dynamic, as all states are seeking to be at the state-of-the-art, which creates this imperative. A second driver that governments need to be aware of is the maintenance of what might be described as operational sovereignty or security of supply, which is to say that if they buy weapons, they need to be sure that they can use them at a time of their choosing and upgrade them where necessary without relying on potentially unreliable supply sources. And the third is to obtain value for money when selecting between alternative weapons systems that they might want to buy, whether from within the United Kingdom or from non-national suppliers. And where our work fits into these imperatives is to interrogate that third driver or imperative governments need to look at, which is value for money. And essentially the space we entered in 2015 was that of a debate between whether the UK should go for an open procurement model, which essentially means meeting requirements for the armed forces by trying to minimise acquisition costs by buying equipment from off the shelf on or from global defence markets. In other words, you shop around, you buy the cheapest. And this became the default in UK procurement policy under the coalition administration in 2012. The work that we've been doing in this impact case study has been to look at a second definition of value for money. And this is a definition that encompasses not only acquisition costs, but national economic, employment, technological returns, strategic influences, benefits from exports, etc., that might occur if the choice were made to acquire weapons systems from the United Kingdom rather than from the open market. So the first definition, open procurement, or the default at the time we started this work, was this idea that you go to the marketplace. The area that space that we've entered is really this broader value for money definition that encompasses the full social welfare and social benefit gains of spending money on acquisition within the UK economy itself. Next slide, please. So in terms of moving this forward, our impact work started in January 2015. We three collectively produced a pamphlet called A Benefit Not a Burden, and it was intended to feed directly into the then ongoing National Security Strategy Strategic Defence Review process that was in train. Our evidence-based review tried to find the best available evidence and study effectively the results indicated that the government's existing policy was deficient because it failed to factor in these wider social benefits and welfare gains I've previously mentioned. The report also found that a thriving defence industrial base is significant as well because it allows the UK armed forces a form of freedom of action, as well as generating significant science, technology and skills within the UK engineering and scientific sector, thereby contributing positively to the UK as an economy as a whole. The report also found that our ability to pinpoint impacts of UK defence procurement expenditure was hindered by a dearth of data, or at least up-to-date data. And this was largely because the MOD had decided to cancel this data collection 5 years before the study that we undertook. And therefore, what the report stressed was the importance of the findings in relation to future procurement choices and potential modifications to UK defence acquisition and defence industrial policy. Next slide, please. In order to try and stimulate that debate and discussion, arrangements were made to circulate the report to all members of the House of Lords and the House of Commons, as well as defence journalists in the national press, the Financial Times, Telegraph, etc., etc. We initiated specialist briefings at King's with the main architects of the 2015 NSS SDSR in the Cabinet Office and the MOD, but beyond that in other ministries as well. And as a consequence of that activity, in effect, parliamentarians sort of came back to us and wanted more. And so specialist briefings were requested by the chairs of significant committees in the House of Commons and the House of Lords, particularly in the areas of defence, all-party parliamentary group for armed forces, and the Public Administration Committee. Next slide, please. So I'm sorry if this slide is difficult to read, but essentially what happened following those initial catalytic activities was a snowball effect. And in a sense, we saw a number of we received a number of approaches from people in policymaking communities. So Comrade Bailey, who was the director responsible for the 2015 NSS SDSR process, requested a high-level meeting involving a range of officials that you can see in my slide there, and very kindly subsequently described the seminar as the single most important meeting before the SDSR, which is rather nice feedback. And we were subsequently invited to provide inputs into the work being conducted by the MOD's chief economist into improving thinking around developing what became National Security Objective number 3 in 2015, the prosperity agenda. We did what you would expect, which is throughout the year submitted evidence, written submissions to the review process itself, and what we saw in effect was a commitment by the government to take into account some of the observations that we've made in its refreshing of defence industrial policy. So in effect, we created a bit of a dynamic and then moved forward in that way. Next slide, please. So we saw those activities taking place in 2015. The NSS SDSR came out, and that was a juncture at which the official opposition, the Labour Party, initiated shadow defence review, and they looked to us to provide them with advice on how they might go about doing that. So a point I'd just make here is that the work that we've been doing has been entirely non-partisan, and so we've been willing to work with parliamentarians from any political parties. So this was quite an interesting development, and the official opposition always has a problem because it doesn't have access to a civil service, so it has to rely on those individuals it can get to talk to it or share expertise with. But we had several meetings with senior defence figures in the shadow cabinet and presented evidence to what was called the Labour Party International Policy Commission, which was effectively their wider review body. I mean, the interesting thing about the work with Labour at the time was that As you probably remember, the party was quite fractured in a number of areas, but particularly in the area of defence expenditure and what defence expenditure should be targeted at. And I think the only thing that the officials and politicians could agree on was that if Labour had to spend money on defence, it should at least provide a payback or revenue through the circulation of that expenditure within UK defence industry to generate skills, jobs, etc., etc. And we also provided more evidence to the House of Commons Defence Committee, in this case on defence acquisition and procurement. Next slide, please. And really, this slide provides a sort of timeline of where the downstream effects of the original report manifested themselves. What we saw in March 2017 was the adoption of a primary recommendation that we made in 2015, and that was around the necessity for the MOD to reinstate annual data capture and official statistics on defence expenditure with UK defence industries and so on and so forth. And that step remains in place and is really significant, I think, to external analysis and accountability in defence, but also as a tool in defence decision making itself. Because by moving towards a broader definition of value for money in defence, statistics become important, data become important in terms of evaluation in a way that is more sophisticated than the requirement that you have with an open procurement policy. Again, we see some reiteration of our initial and ongoing work in the so-called Dunn Review, which is essentially looking at how UK defence contributes to UK national prosperity. So as a sort of leitmotif was evident there. And since then, a key output of the Dunn Review itself was the establishment of the Joint Economic Data Hub, the JED Hub. And its job is really to assess the economic and wider value of defence expenditure to the UK and its economy. And we were invited to be lead advisor on the establishment of this new institution, and it's doing good work as we speak. Next slide, please. More recently, we've tried to keep this surfing on a wave motion with this project going by some more diversified interventions. So in June of this year, the team of Ben, Andrew and me, coupled with Trevor Taylor from Cranfield University and Alice Panier from Johns Hopkins University in the United States, produced a fairly hefty report. It's feeding into the defence security and industrial strategy work that's ongoing in Whitehall and Westminster at the moment. And so we're looking forward to receiving formal feedback on that when it goes through the policy machine. And in parallel, we're also doing work on the prosperity benefits from UK defence on a project that's being sponsored by the DSTL organisation, and the findings of that report will be generated, we hope, within the next 3 to 6 months or so. Next slide, please. The point I'm making here is that with impact work, there's need for verification, and this is something we've majored on all the way throughout this project from the word go, keeping a very closely documented timeline of activities. And what I can say, to paraphrase a long document on verification, that we have written testimony relating to all of the impact activities and outcomes I've mentioned in the presentation. As I say, we're waiting for formal feedback on the inputs we're making to the DSIS process. This will initially be obtained from a face-to-face meeting with the Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, on the 7th of July. Unfortunately, I'm doing that on my own, so I have to be on my my best behaviour and focus, but that should be, or testimony from the Defence Secretary should be featuring within our evidence base or verification base. I think it's probably fair to say that the decisions made by the MOD post 2015 have tended, if you like, to draw upon the sort of stuff we're doing because of its relevance to this national security objective number 3 around prosperity. Next slide, please. So behind this is underpinning academic work. I've outlined some of the publications relevant to this there. Next slide, please. And some of the non-academic, if you like, more policy-focused outputs from the project. Next slide, please. So key reflections. Next slide, please. In no particular order, I think it's very much fair to say that the group I've been working with is firmly of the view that research impact on public policy can be mutually reinforcing and beneficial, I think, both to academia gaining a better understanding of how the machine of defence works, if you like, in the defence acquisition and defence policy space. So I can quite genuinely say I think it feels like a good thing to be doing, and it's quite rewarding intellectually. As you probably inferred from what I've said, the approach that we adopted was to collaborate effectively, create a division of labour. Ben, Andy and I all have our own projects in train, and therefore working as a core team enabled a division of labour and tapping into expertise as well as helping them maintain momentum. A key thing in this process seems to be identifying gatekeepers, those core individuals that can open doors and get that message out there. And we were very fortunate to have Lord Stirling in the House of Lords assisted in the early days to get together with the really key decision makers. I think it's probably fair to say that achieving impact isn't something that's done in the margins. It requires a deliberate long-term strategy, but coupled with that must be the need to be agile when new targets of opportunity arise. And finally, it's quite enjoyable. Interacting with policymaking communities has an opportunity cost. It takes time to get up to London, etc., etc. But it also has an energizing and intellectually stimulating set of outcomes, I think. So I'm mindful of the time. I'm mindful that I probably talked a little bit too long, and the technical glitches have wasted a bit of time. So I think if we can move now to the next slide and to questions.
Thanks, Nat. I have several questions there. Mainly from Warren, actually. He appears to be trolling you. So I'm going to start with his first question here. Or Warren, do you want to ask them yourself? No, is his answer. Okay.
So it's like, has he retracted the questions, or?
No, he's got loads up here, but he wants me to ask them on his behalf. So first question then, do all states seek to be state-of-the-art, and how has CAD-CAM impacted on time cost performance estimates in acquisition?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Do all states seek to be state-of-the-art?
Yeah.
And how has CAD, CAD, and then CAM, CAM, presume you know what that means, impacted on time?
Can you ask him to can you ask him to spell out the acronyms, please? I didn't quite get.
CAD.
Yeah.
And CAM.
Right.
How have they impacted on time cost performance estimates in acquisition?
Short answer to that question is, well, there are actually two questions there, aren't there? Do all states strive to be at the state of the art? No. If we look at the, if you like, the hierarchy of defence production, and therefore who can produce state-of-the-art capabilities, the number of countries who can do that is quite small. Essentially, we're looking at the United States, increasingly China, moving up the league table, Russia, with a defence expenditure slightly higher than the UK's, and France and the UK, if you like, being in that kind of position. So these are the countries that can make state-of-the-art defence capabilities. Arguably, the US is the only member of that group that can make state-of-the-art or produce state-of-the-art capabilities across the board. Countries like the United Kingdom are unable to do that on their own in all sectors. In terms of the way that technologies have affected the acquisition process, it's not something I've looked at in particular in terms of time, cost, and performance. What I would say is that improvements in technology haven't seemed to have had a huge impact on some of the perennial difficulties we find in the acquisition process, of the sort, Warren, that were identified in your book on procurement. So, in terms, therefore, of the acquisition process, as far as I'm aware, at least, they haven't had a significant effect in reducing uncertainty in development of defence capabilities in terms of cost, time, and performance.
Okay, so there's a follow-up question there from Andy Corbett, asking whether there's a need for the UK to remain at state of the art in that case, and are there opportunity costs?
There are opportunity costs in the sense that the cost, there's a margin of diminishing return with investment in terms of pushing the technological envelope forwards. In other words, to increase performance of a system by 2 or 3% might double the equipment cost, notionally at least. And so there is a definite trade-off between, if you like, quality and quantity, for instance. And that might, the outcome of that calculation might vary in different environments when we're looking at, say, land systems or space or air systems. So this is a choice or a trade-off that states need to make in terms of their affordability.
Okay, there's another one here, again from Warren. He asked, if you're seeking to achieve wider economic benefits, why not just invest in commercial R&D and value-added industries rather than supporting the defence industrial base? And then a follow-up to that is there an ethical question which impacts on UK reputation overseas?
Well, so the study that, well, okay, right. So there are certain conditions that are in place when we look at defence markets, and they relate to the buyer and the supply side. So governments are the only legitimate customers for defence products, and you have a situation where, in many cases, the sheer difficulty and costs of developing large military capabilities means that you have a comparatively small number of firms able to act as major systems integrators. So what we don't have in defence is a normal marketplace. You've got sort of monopsony, and you've got something that can be tending towards monopoly supply in many cases. That differs from the commercial marketplace and commercial technological innovation. So if you work on the assumption that states need armed services and need defence capability, then that raises the question of whether or not they are sensible areas for government to invest public money in, given that they are totally reliant upon governments as their sole customers. And a point that we made or identified and developed very early in this impact project was looking at precisely that question. What kind of return do you get as a government if you invest your money in the defence sector, as opposed to other industrial sectors in the economy? And what that research tells us is that the kind of economic returns you get are middling. So they're not as high as some potential government investments, but they're higher than others. And the way that you kind of measure this is to look at what's known as multiplier effects. So, if government spends a notional X on this, what does that mean in terms of its generation of follow-on economic activity? In terms of employment, skills developments, direct impacts on the industry itself, but also on the development of associated supply chains as other companies, possibly even high-tech companies or from the civilian marketplace, come in and get involved. So I could go on about this a bit, but probably just to truncate the answer somewhat. It's not unreasonable for governments to invest in defence, because the return that they're making, or the return to the UK economy, is as it would be in many other engineering and technology sectors. Moving on to the ethical question, I may be answering the wrong question here, Warren, but is this about arms exports in particular? Are you getting at something that relates to whether or not the UK should export arms, or maybe I've missed the question?
The answer is yes.
Arms exports?
Yeah.
Arms exports are a highly regulated area, or part of what the UK does. Historically, there have been problems, particularly in relation to earlier arms sales to Saudi Arabia. So they are a regulated area of export, and are scrutinised closely by Parliament and other bodies. The argument, I suppose, would also be that arms transfers have a political and strategic dimension above and beyond the economic dimension. So they provide an opportunity for the UK, in certain respects, to support what might be considered to be friendly states, or states with which the UK wishes to build defence relations. I'm not sitting here as an advocate of the arms trade, or sort of saying that there should be unbridled arms exports, but I think we have to see arms exports as being one of those quite tricky questions when it comes to ethics. I'm not an ethicist by training, but I can see that there are different sides to that, particularly where assumptions when arms exports were made do not come true, and we see regime changes and we see destabilizing outcomes.
Okay, thanks for that. There aren't any other questions up at the moment. Warren's given you a thumbs up for that answer. Oh, hang on, he did ask if your conception of value for money is retro, i.e. old.
Well, if he can furnish me with a non-retro definition, then that would help. That would help facilitate a conversation on this.
I'm waiting.
Okay, so can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah, okay. So I think my position here is that you have a sort of, as you said, a neoliberal version of value for money articulated by the Thatcher government, and then that carries through into the 1990s. And then gradually we sort of rode back from that. But actually, for the first 40 years of British defence industrial policy, the whole conception of value for money was essentially geared around employment, technology, balance of payments, and showing the wider economic benefits of how weapons procurement, or defence procurement as it was called then, fed into so many different areas of government policy. And I think what is interesting is that those debates are challenged eventually. And that's one of the reasons why even, someone like Margaret Thatcher comes to the conclusion that actually this is unaffordable, and much of it is largely unproven. And it just seems that what you present in many ways is a return to that. So I'd be interested in knowing how your conception of value for money now differs from the historical conception of value for money pre sort of 1984, and where you think how you're going to actually ensure that policymakers don't make the same kinds of mistakes that policymakers and officials in MOD made during that period of the Cold War.
Okay, thanks for that, Warren. I think we need to acknowledge quite significant differences from between that era that you talk about, if you like, prior to what were then the Sir Peter Levine reforms under the Thatcher government, and the situation now. So we were talking about a defence industrial sector before the early 80s that was essentially largely under government ownership in some shape or form. At a time when, I think during the Cold War, there was this idea of a defence industrial base was something that was kind of solidified into the notion of statehood, given relatively high levels of defence expenditure and threat perception during the Cold War period. You then see, I think, as you point out in your own work, this move towards the so-called Levine reforms, which seek to make as much of defence procurement as possible like purchasing in a normal market economy, and that persists. But at the same time, we see de facto defence industrial policies at play. So rolling that forward, if you look at the Labour administrations, what we see at work there is an acceptance that the market is important, and that we can no longer think in terms of an entirely standalone, nationally owned and regulated defence industrial base. We see a role for the market there, but we also see recognition that some sectors are strategically important and are worthy of support in the procurement process on the grounds that they provide reliable sources of supply, and at the same time provide technological and economic gains of the sort that I've intimated we covered in the report that we produced. So if we look at policy now, what we see is a recognition that markets are important where possible. They help to stimulate innovation, and so this is not a binary issue. Markets feature there. And in that regard, industries are required to demonstrate that they are using competitive mechanisms to put together their bids and their teams delivering to MOD solutions. But there's also recognition that when we're talking about these capabilities, and we have to bear in mind that as intergenerational cost increases have occurred, major defence systems these days are hugely expensive and purchased in very small orders. That these wider welfare gains should be identified and considered in value for money assessments. A key development here has been in relation to the Treasury. So the Treasury has been migrating its value for money definition away from that very narrow, if you like, cost, lead time, performance set of questions towards a wider assessment using welfare economics that looks at the net social impacts on the United Kingdom from making choice A or choice B in procurement. So in the way that when government looks at investment in something, like this is a controversial one, so it's probably a bad example, but HS2 or something of that nature, they are looking at the wider impact of that investment in terms of the delivery of a capability, which is a railway network or augmentation to a railway network, but also the wider impacts that derive from that. So then to come back to your question. Are we in the same place that we found ourselves, let's say, in that period before the Levine reforms? No, the same fundamental trade-offs are still being talked about, but I think the context in which that's being discussed and being developed in public policy terms is rather different. So, I mean, I think the hope that we have in this. In terms of the work we've been doing, is really that in calibrating between those two extremes, we've managed to push the pendulum in the direction of a more sophisticated value for money definition that factors in and weights different considerations that do include the impact on skills in the United Kingdom, do impact upon potential influence and leverage the UK might get through arms transfers, and I suppose I'd probably stop there. So I think it's a really good question. I think that there is a risk of what you say, but I don't think it's very high because I think the conditions are different.
So I wouldn't disagree with you at all, Matt. And actually, I think that your concept of value for money as it stands now probably is more in line with how people are generally thinking anyway. I think they've stepped back from that, and in a sense, even the pandemic has revealed the idea of simply relying on the global free market to provide everything you need, as demonstrated by the absence or failure of PPE, etc. That there are other considerations that need to be taken into account. But I think what is interesting about your study, and you began it really with this idea of empiricism and the data. So if you can find the data and you can actually measure the effect, that I think would be a really big departure from how policy was shaped and driven pre-1979. And I assume that's the kind of thing that you, Andy, and Ben are trying to actually generate, finding ways of getting the answers and the methodologies that allow you to provide solid evidence to show these things are working in the way that we believe they are, rather than basically saying, yeah, well, we kind of think it works, but actually we don't really know beyond here's a few sort of figures we can throw at you.
Yeah, I mean, this is work that's ongoing, and this is work that is that we can't do this. We as a small team can't do this on our own. It's a much bigger issue, and it really relates to the national security objective number 3, the prosperity agenda. Because politicians, and I think probably people more generally, intuitively see that national defence, can provide some economic benefits. The existence of a Royal Navy that keeps sea lines of communication open, diplomacy, a whole range of other things that defence does, potentially creates a more stable international environment in which trade takes place and creates forms of prosperity. And the really tricky thing is to try and monetize a lot of this stuff, because it's difficult to measure the output of defence with any degree of granularity. It's really difficult. And if you can't measure the output, you can't monetize elements of the output. So this is a big problem. But bringing it back down to the defence industrial space, I think we have moved forward a long way. I mean, we have some quite sophisticated studies now emerging on, for instance, the shipbuilding sector, and the kind of bow wave effects you get through local expenditures within shipbuilding locations in the UK. So the fact that the data sets are re-emerging now is really good. The JED Hub, which I mentioned in the presentation, is a real step forward. So you've got an interdisciplinary group, if you like. It's not MOD, it's not the defence industry, it's not academia, but they're all collaborating in that space in Farnborough to get their heads around some of these questions. So rather than going at it with an ideological hat, with a let's follow the data, let's follow the evidence kind of hat. So I'm reasonably optimistic that progress is being made in this area, but certainly judging by the work we're doing on the prosperity impacts of defence, there's a group of, I can't say too much about this, but there are probably going to be 6 or 7 separate projects involving large numbers of people, looking at different ways of conceptualizing the problems and gaining some traction in trying to work out what they mean empirically. So it's not going to be finished anytime soon, and it's giving me a migraine when I think about it, because it really is quite challenging philosophically as well as empirically.
No, that's good. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Warren.
There was a question from Andy Corbett. He's had to go, but the question about the impact of swarm technology, AI, and what that's going to do to the value for money idea. And then there's a long question from Greg. I might let him ask that. And Chris Kinsey has his hand up. So Chris, if you can just hang on till Greg's asked his, and then, yeah, Matt can answer all 3 at the same time.
Okay. Swarm technologies, Andy Corbett. Yeah. So should I do that first, or have the other?
Yeah. I was gonna, if Greg is still there, if he wants to ask his question. If not, we'll skip straight to Chris, who's got his hand up.
Do you want me to ask mine, Tracy? Greg doesn't appear to be answering.
Go ahead.
It's very
Greg,
simple.
Greg's fallen.
Very simple question, Matt. I'm sure you thought about it, and it just struck me listening to your presentation, which I found very interesting. MODs, and not just the UK, but MODs in general, have always struggled to bring these big infrastructural projects in on time and to the stated cost. We don't necessarily see that in the commercial sector. And I'm now thinking about the aviation industry, the oil industry, the shipbuilding industry. They're extremely good at project management and ensuring that projects do stay on time and do come in as costed. Maybe some of your thoughts on why governments in particular and the procurement process is very struggles to actually achieve this. Now, it may be that they're getting better, and you may have found this in your research, but I would be interested your thoughts on this, and whether governments are getting better at ensuring this, or whether they still have a problem, and if they can learn from the commercial sector.
Okay. So shall we assume Greg's disappeared?
No, he did say it's a question, not a statement. It's something for you to consider. So you can have a look at the question. It's about defence investment procurement principles and values from the imperial age. Have a look at the question when
okay.
we're done.
Yeah. So I think going back to Andy Corbett's question about swarm technologies. I mean, what we're seeing at work is quite a lot of thinking taking place on these so-called disruptive technologies might actually look like in the contemporary battle space. And what we can see is a growing interest in government, obviously, in ways in which it may harness innovations that draw on, if you like, civilian innovation and technology, and defense needs. So there's a new technology strategy, fairly new technology strategy, which is looking at precisely the ways in which things like artificial intelligence, robotics, and so on and so forth can be brought into the procurement space. And what we see there really is a call by government to draw in interested parties within relevant commercial industrial sectors to look to, if you like, co-design potential outcomes. So I think we're at a point in time with defence thinking where we've seen policies emerge. We've seen overtures by government to industries to see whether or not they can be engaged in bringing on stream these sorts of technological innovations, whilst recognising at the same time that there's likely to be a role for large capability platforms of the sort that we're used to, that are more established. I'll probably leave that there if I may, because I'm mindful of the time. Chris, thank you for your observation. It's been a constant mantra throughout history that governments are not good at picking winners, and we can probably look back over a number of many decades and see cases where governments have chosen to invest public money in major projects, and the outcome has been huge delay, cost overrun, or inadequate performance at the outset of that. I think the interesting thought I have emerging from your question is, so we see examples of great success in the civilian sector in bringing technology online. I suppose the Elon Musk, the recent space flight would be a good example of that. But when we look at defence procurement, we see a situation where there's a huge amount of scrutiny of project management and project development. Now, I don't know much about the recent commercial space flight. What I don't know is what assumptions were made at the outset of that project in terms of how long it would take, and how much it was going to cost, and what it was going to do. And it could well be the case that that's an example where the private sector has done all of this within those parameters very effectively. But if we look at the defence context, the problem appears to be a mismatch between initial assumptions about cost and or development time and or system performance and what actually happens throughout that process. And it seems to me that we need to be careful to ensure we're comparing apples and apples when we're talking about government procurement and private sector procurement and major projects. And I think in the case of defence, the tricky thing really is having to decide how much a statement of requirement will need in terms of cost and time to bring that to fruition as a major system. And that process involves risk analysis. You could take a very pessimistic view, stretch those out as far as possible, and come in within budget and come in within predicted time by making it or de-risking it hugely, those assumptions. Or you could, on the other hand, take a more optimistic view. And I think it's probably fair to say that the issues that have occurred, the problems with major programs in defence, are largely to do with the problems of predicting. And so how does defence do that? How does it do that predictive thing? what it tries to do is to start off with a major project by saying, well, we've done this kind of thing before, so it should cost about this amount, or it should take about this long. But technology has moved on a little bit, or significantly in that area, so we need to make more conservative assumptions about those things. So a lot of the shockers in defence have largely been due, I think, to overly optimistic initial assumptions that have been proved false or overly optimistic. And I don't really get the sense of where that fits in with many of these private sector comparators. It could well be that they are more efficiently managed. But equally, it could be effectively that we just don't know enough about those initial assumptions, those starting conditions and final outputs when comparing the two. Sorry, that was rather long-winded. I hope it does some justice, Chris, to your very good question.
Matt, Greg's got his hand up. Wants to ask something.
Yeah.
Hey, Matt.
Hi, Greg.
Good. Your question about, I mean, there's a whole bunch of things. There's great project. I mean, one of the things that I'm struck by is that why all of a sudden does everybody think that there needs to be this accuracy and level of granularity? I mean, I can appreciate they may want more, and particularly the evidence base to be able to prove even trends or broader themes. But deciding just kind of what level of clarity is required and what micro level you want to go to, I think is incredibly important as to how then you're going to structure the rest of your research plan. And one of the things that you might consider, I remember doing a bit of work on the impact of the Royal Navy on if it had a base at a port city. So what was the difference of being just a straight up civilian port versus being one that had a Royal Navy in the 18th and 19th century? And this is where the thing that I'd mentioned in the chat area was that looking at the kind of ways that historians have looked at the impact, because this system, I would say, that you're talking about in terms of how the UK is moving is very imperial. It goes very much back to the day of the use of these kinds of spending and this kind of acquisition and this kind of concern about the utility of this money, both internally and externally, to that age. So my other point would be, in terms of your modern methodology, at the kind of council level, I'll bet you'll find that there's a lot of impact that can be done in terms of the quantitative evaluations if you get a couple of good enthusiastic PhD students. And I mean, a classic case is the Defense Academy itself. I mean, all you have to do is look at the local councils and the local region and see what the impact of having, the Defense Academy. We went from nothing to having McDonald's. All you have to do is go through the Gulshan books and what's the revenue intake, what's the prosperity agenda in the Shrivenham area of having this thing here that we work in. And you could multiply that across the UK in terms of facilities, bases, inputs, et cetera. But I mean, my point about that is that I think some of the data is there. It's just not the MOD isn't holding it. You need to, be able to hoover it up and vacuum it up, because Swindon knows what Honda's worth. So these councils, these places will also know what defense is worth. So if you're talking about taking defense out, they will probably have a pretty good idea of what that would mean to their local economies. So if you think about it kind of like Swindon car plant approach, and you think about defense in that sense, I think you'll be able, you could survey councils, you could survey all kinds of these places that are in contact with the MOD in some way, be it facilities, be it, plants, etc., and then be able to extrapolate out from there what the impact is. Because I think the point you made about, shipping lanes and, those things are much more amorphous. Yes, we have a Navy and therefore it has an influence on the security of. Yes, it does. Prove it. But doing that operational or more internal operational level prosperity agenda thing, I think, yeah, definitely you can. Sorry, long-winded way of.
No, it's very good. Thank you. Two sort of quick responses to those. Thanks very much for that. I mean, I think your point about this imperial era, you were talking about the way the UK saw itself in terms of what it needed to do and what it should be as a maritime or wider defence power. And I agree. Well, I agree with that. I defer to your historical knowledge, but I would argue that I suspect that ideational dimension persists to this day. But we wrote a piece actually on something related to this last year. I can circulate copies if you wish, but essentially arguing that ideationally we find it very difficult to walk away from this first tier defence power status, and an ingredient of that first tier power status is to have a reasonably comprehensive defence industrial capacity. So I think that hubris is still there, and is arguably evident in the development of the global Britain concept. I don't want to get too political on this point, but this aspiration that Britain backs up its new trading relationships with military relationships and a more outward or global positioning. Interestingly, the points you make about your example of the Defence Academy, we're beginning to see now with this reintroduction of defence statistics, evidence that helps us or talks directly to the questions or observations that you raised there. So what defence is now doing is working out on a regional basis where, if you like, the defence pound is being invested in the regions within the United Kingdom, how many people that expenditure employs directly in those regions, a percentage of jobs in those regions dependent upon direct defence expenditure. They also allow for a calculation of indirect employment and economic consequences. In other words, the Defence Academy is there, like Honda is there. The Defence Academy has suppliers who are paid, if you like, out of the defence budget. So that's indirect employment. And then the third of the outer ring of that, if you like, is what we might call induced employment, which is the guy who sets, or the person who sets up a kebab wagon near the gates of Honda because it's probably a good place to sell kebabs. So I think really a kind of heartening aspect of this is that this reinvigoration of data and statistics in defence is significant because it answers precisely those questions. So thanks for raising that point.
Right. I think we've reached the end of all our questions, Matt. You've done a sterling job. It's a long session. Thank you so much. Thank you to everybody who's asked questions and engaged. And Danny has recorded this, so it will be going up on our YouTube page at a later date. But thanks, Matt.
Thank you.
And thank you, everybody. It's good to see you all.